Hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs here in Sydney. It's very nice to see such a large crowd to come along tonight and listen to a topic that could hardly be of greater relevance: Russia and the Ukraine war. Our speaker is Emeritus Professor Graeme Gill. He was Professor of Government at the University of Sydney and a long-time student of Soviet and Russian politics. He's been a frequent visit to Russia and an author of many works on that subject. The war in Ukraine is now approaching the 18-month mark. There's some talk of a certain degree of war fatigue setting in. Some questions about Western support, some questions on the Russian side about domestic support. Many issues for Graeme to address tonight. He'll speak to us for around 30 minutes, and following that we'll have 30 minutes for questions and discussion. So without further ado, it's over to Graeme Gill.
Thank you, Ian. Can I say I'm really pleased to be here tonight. When Ian raised the prospect of me talking, he said that he thought it would be a good idea for me to focus principally upon Russia and upon the situation in Russia and its and the impact of the war upon Russia. So I'm going to direct most of my remarks to that, and then towards the end I'll say something about where I think it's all going to go. So firstly, Russian internal affairs, and I'm going to divide it into three sections. I'll talk first about the economy, and then about society, and then about the politics. Now, the economy has actually been a much better performed beast than many people thought it would be. When the first lot of sanctions were introduced in February-March 2022, many people argued that the economy of Russia would stall, that it would not be able to sustain a prolonged war effort, and that what we were likely to see was major economic crisis. Actually, that hasn't happened. Now, all of the figures I'm going to be talking about in this talk are a bit problematic. In other words, you can't get good data on some of the things I'm going to be talking about. But as far as we can tell, and what the general agreement is that in the first year of the war, 2022, the Russian economy shrank by about 2%. Ukrainian economy shrank by 22%, according to some estimates. According to other estimates, it was 45%, but the Russian economy appears to have shrunk by about 2%. And it's projected this year that it may grow by about something a little bit less than 1%. So if you look at that performance compared with the performance of the post-COVID economies in the West, it's actually not too bad. If we look at what's happened, there have been few shortages in Russia. It was expected that we might see lines in the streets for food and for other goods, but there have been relatively few shortages, except in the high-tech electronic area, where Russia relied upon parts from the West to feed into their production schedule. But elsewhere, there have been relatively few shortages. The exit of major Western firms from Russia was seen as being a major problem, but increasingly the imports that came in have been replaced both by domestic production, enhanced domestic production, because what you've had is import substitution going on, but also increased exports from the rest of the world. Apparently now, if you wander around Moscow, you're struck by the number of Chinese-made cars that are there, and they clearly weren't there, certainly when I was last there, which is 2019. So there have been increased imports from the global south and from China. Furthermore, there's been no unemployment, relatively no unemployment. That's actually not surprising, because in a war economy, when a significant proportion of the young men who would normally be working in the civilian economy go off to war, well, then increased job opportunities open up, and there is in fact a tight labour market in Russia. Now, why this performance? Why was the economy has it been able to sustain itself despite the impact of the Western sanctions? Well, there are a number of reasons. First is oil and gas revenues. In 2022, oil and gas revenues flowed into Russia almost at the same level as they had before that. And this was important in providing a continuing income stream into the economy, despite the sanctions. Domestic production has increased. The removal of Western firms from Russia and of Western goods from Russia means that domestic Russian-made goods became competitive in the way in which they weren't when they had to compete against Western-made products. So that what you've got has, through this import substitution, has been a stimulus to Russian domestic production, including, of course, the war economy, because what Russia has done has been to transform significant parts of its economy into making the material for war, where formerly they may have been making tractors or cars or whatever. They're now making war material. Government spending. The government has poured an enormous amount of money into the economy. It has dipped deeply into its reserves, into its sovereign wealth fund. Prior to the war, Russia had one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world, because they religiously put money from the oil and gas sector into sovereign wealth fund. So they had a big war chest, if you like, and they've dipped into that substantially. And that's not only been directed towards building up the military side of the economy, but they've also put it towards things like pensions and salaries. And this is clearly a conscious strategy in order to dampen down any possible unrest that might develop. Furthermore, the Russian economy was never as integrated into the world economy as many other countries were. Most Russian goods, most goods that were made in Russia, were not sold in the West, and it's the West that imposed the sanctions. To the extent that they were sold in the global South. Most of the global South has not adhered to the sanctions. But in any case, a significant part of the Russian economy was directed simply at domestic needs, not at export, and therefore it was less affected by the sanctions. And finally, of course, there are ways of circumventing sanctions. We can get around sanctions in various ways, and this is actually facilitated by some of the NATO countries and members of the EU. The question, of course, is, can it continue? And there are three, I don't know whether you call them storms that may be on the horizon, but three question marks on the ability of the economy to continue to function in this way. The first is that at this stage, oil and gas revenues for 2023 have halved compared with 2022. So this is a major income stream coming into the economy, which is not exactly dried up, but is clearly much less substantial than it was before. Secondly, reserves are not inexhaustible. They can't continue to dig into the reserves to continue to help the economy to function. And finally, inflation is now becoming a problem. central bank sees inflation as an increasingly important problem, and it's clear that what they're doing in terms of inflation is to reap the consequences of the amount of money that they put into the economy in previous years. But the message to leave you with is that the economy has not suffered the sort of consequences that it was thought that it would, and that it has been able to sustain the Russian war effort, and I suspect it's likely to be able to do that for some time into the future. Society. The impression that you get is that, by and large, in the big cities, people are going about their lives as they did before. They are not experiencing shortages in the shops. They are not experiencing a sense of crisis. They're not experiencing war weariness. They're not experiencing the sort of sense of deprivation that you might expect in a country which has been at war like this for 18 months. Now, clearly those comments don't apply to all parts of the country. I mean, there is resentment in some of the non-Russian ethnic areas, because the mobilisation that took place in September last year of 300,000 it took place at a rather, not quite sure how to say this, proportionally far more non-ethnic Russians were mobilised into the armed forces in September than they consisted of the population, so that the concentration on non-Russian ethnic areas in the mobilisation was clear, and it was felt by the people in those areas, so that there is that sort of resentment there. But that hasn't translated into a broad sense of resentment against the war, and I'll say something more about that in a moment. Corruption remains a major problem. In 2022, according to Transparency International, Russia's score was 28 out of 100. The lower your rank, the more corrupt you are. Sorry, the lower your score, the more corrupt you are. So Russia's score was 28 out of 100, Australia was 75. Its rank was 137 out of 180. And in this sense, the lower your rank, the less corrupt you are. Australia's was 13 out of 180. So corruption is still a problem, and the war is likely to have enhanced it. Because in a wartime economy, particularly when you've got this amount of money sloshing around, when notions of corporate accountability and when notions of personal accountability are so weak, the gate is wide open for corruption. The same may be said for Ukraine, and actually Ukraine's scores in Transparency International are slightly better than Russia's, but we're only talking 1 or 2 points on the scale. Now, there have been very few anti-war demonstrations. Why not more? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is popular support. There are two major public opinion polling bodies within Russia. One is close to the Kremlin, and one is independent. The independent one, the Levada Centre, is considered by Western polling agencies as an organisation with integrity. In other words, they accept, by and large, the figures that the Levada Centre produces. And over the length of the war, there has traditionally been a high level of support for it, sitting in the 70s for a lot of the time. Support for the special military operation, as Putin called it. been in the 70% range. And the pollsters from the Levada Centre explain this by saying that the war, that essentially the population has accepted the message that the regime is giving, and that is that the war is not a war against our brothers, the Ukrainians. It's a war against the US and NATO, and therefore they support it. But this 70% support level, if you dig down a bit in it, it's not quite as clear. There's certainly strong support, and this support level is growing, a strong support for the end of the war. More and more people want to see the war ended. But, and this is the crucial but, they don't want to see Russia defeated. So while they want to see an end to the war, they want to see it with Russia being victorious. So the first reason why there has not been massive demonstrations is the level of popular support. But of course also crucial has been the vigorous crackdown on opposition that's taken place. Now the crackdown on opposition began in 2012 when Putin was re-elected as president. If you remember, he was elected first in 2000 and then re-elected in 2004. There was a two-term limit in the constitution, so at the end of his term in 2008 he stood down. His Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, was then elected president, and then he named Putin as Prime Minister. And then in 2012, when Medvedev's term ended, Putin stood again and he was elected to a new six-year term. Since that time, the pressure on the public space in Russia has been heightened. Most important in this was the introduction, soon after Putin was re-elected, of what is called the Foreign Agents Law. What this law essentially says is that if you're an organisation and you get any money from abroad, you have to register as a foreign agent. Now, the term foreign agent has a resonance in Russia from the Soviet period, because this was one of the terms that was used in the purges in 1937-38 under Stalin. And this law has been used to close down a series of organisations, particularly those involved in human rights activities, in monitoring human rights, including the very important Memorial, which was set up under Gorbachev as an independent organisation, and it kept an eye on human rights activities in Russia. Anyway, that was closed down earlier this year. But the foreign agent law has gradually been tightened, and the last tightening included the provision that it would apply to individuals. So if an individual gets money from abroad, they have, in theory, they have to register as a foreign agent. And that's, when you think about it, depends on how money is defined. But if you're a Russian scholar in Russia, and someone like me asks you to contribute a chapter to a book, as I did before this war started, and they actually contribute it, and they get a free copy of the book as recompense, does that then mean they've got to register under the Foreign Agents Law? Maybe it does. The point is that what it does is that it gives the regime a really powerful law to use against dissenters. There's been increased censorship. Various independent organs have been closed down, and those that continue to publish have to be anodyne in what they say. You cannot criticise the military. You cannot make any comment that might even in any way be construed as criticism of the military or of the war effort, because that would be treason. There has been a vigorous suppression of demonstrations. There were demonstrations in the big cities in the first part of 2022, but those were vigorously broken up by the authorities. And major critics of the regime have been either locked up, so that the most recent one is Vladimir Putin, who was locked up in the middle of this year, a long-standing, outspoken critic of the regime, and of course Alexei Navalny, who you probably all know about, who survived the poisoning attempt a couple of years ago. He's had his prison sentence increased by 10 years. So there's clearly been a vigorous crackdown on opposition. So what we have is a society which at this stage has been essentially quiescent, by and large quiescent. Now we move on to the politics. There has been considerable talk, even wishful thinking, about Putin's weakened position. The number of articles that have appeared in the press since February 2022, arguing that Putin's in a weak position, that he's going to fall and so forth, have been legion. Now, if we're looking at Putin's position, the important thing to bear in mind is that in authoritarian regimes of this sort, the overwhelming number of cases in which a leader has been overthrown, they've not been overthrown by marching in the streets. It's not been the populace who have done it. It's been the elite. It's been a split within the group at the top who move against the leader and remove him. Now, of course, there are a lot of things we don't know about Russia, including what's happening within the elite, for obvious reasons. We don't even know what's happening within the elite here very often. So how are we going to know in a society like the Russian? However, within the elite, it's clear that there were elements of it who thought the war was a bad idea, right from the outset. There is a group might be too strong a word. There were people, there were elements there who thought the war was a bad idea. There are others who thought the war has been prosecuted badly and it hasn't been pursued vigorously enough. So the problem is not that we shouldn't have gone to war, the problem is that we should have gone in boots and all right from the start. And many people within this group have had their economic prospects harmed by the war, through the sanctions essentially mainly. But if we look at the regime, and if we look at what people who study the regime look at how they see it, they argue that the regime is by and large one in which you have a series of factions or clans or groups, whatever you want to call them, who are operating in elite circles. And Putin is not really a member of any. He is the guy who stands above and mediates. He's the guy who certainly makes the final decisions. He's the guy who, if there's a dispute between two of these groups, decides who is going to have their way. The important thing about it is that most of these people in the elite depend upon Putin. He's the person who put them there, or he's the person who ensures that the company they operate is successful and is continues to bring in the wealth that they require. In other words, you have this elite system in which Putin is central to it. And if Putin were to go, there would then be no mediator. And they know this. They know this. And this brings us to Wagner and Prigozhin. You will remember that in the middle of the year, The Wagner group, which is a mercenary group that's run by a person who was quite close to Putin, they had fought during they had fought in Ukraine, and while they were in Ukraine, Prigozhin, their leader, had been very critical of the higher echelons of the military and the defence minister. But highly critical is probably an understatement. I mean, historically, Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, hates the defence minister, Sergei Shoigu, with a passion. So if you remember, the Wagner group came out of Ukraine. They seemed to take over military headquarters in the south of Russia, and then some of them began to march on Moscow. Now, what was this about? If you read the press here, they talk about an attempted coup against Putin. 2 nights ago or 3 nights ago, I can't remember which one it was, on the news, the ABC newsreader talked about the Prigozhin's attempted coup against Putin. It wasn't a coup against Putin at all. It was an attempt. Think back to what I said about the elite. It was an attempt by one group or one faction to force Putin's hand against another group, against the leadership of the military, against the defence minister. There was no support for Putin, no support for Prigozhin within the elite. Once Putin had made his position clear, just this 10-hour period when the sort of mutiny starts and we don't hear from Putin, and people are saying, this shows how weak he is. He's running around, he's hiding, he's blah, blah, blah. Clearly what he was doing was checking in with the major forces around him that they were still on side. Once he made his position clear, he said, Prigozhin, this is treason. What happened? Prigozhin stopped. Wagner people stopped. They turned around and they went back to the south, and then they went off under this deal with the Belarus leader to go into Belarus. So basically, the coup attempt ended when Putin said, stop. It was not a sign of his weakness. It was a sign of his strength. Well, I would argue that it's unlikely to be any move against Putin in the near future unless there's a disastrous defeat in the war. And what this means is that Putin cannot afford for Russia to be seen to lose. He cannot afford for people within Russia, high-level people within Russia, to believe that they've lost. And that clearly has implications for where the war is going to go. So where is it going to go? It's pretty clear that the Ukrainian counter-offensive, launched with much fanfare, or the fanfare preceded it, launched in early June, has been labouring. It has not made the major breakthrough on the ground that many people expected it to have. It's in difficulties. We are now only a matter of weeks outside when, or weeks away from when the fighting will probably stop because of the weather conditions, because the ground gets so slushy and you can't move your armed equipment and that very well. And within that time, it's likely that the Ukrainian offensive is not going to go anywhere fast. What I'd suggest is that what this reflects is that the war cannot be ended quickly. And it cannot be ended on Ukrainian terms. And that's because the Ukrainian counter-offensive has 2 major problems, 2 major deficiencies. The first is equipment. I mean, they just don't have enough Western supplied firepower to make a difference. We're talking about 1,000 kilometres front. And so giving them 25 tanks is not going to do very much at all. There are clear equipment shortages, equipment deficiencies, and it's by no means clear now that these can be easily rectified. If you look at what's happened in the US with the Republicans, the group of Republicans, preventing further aid to Ukraine, if you look at the election of the Slovak government in the government in Slovakia, which is likely to take an anti-continuation of support position. The Poles are already in dispute with the Ukrainians, basically over wheat, and they've said they won't give any more weapons. And of course, now we have Israeli-Hamas conflict in the Middle East. Western supply chains are already stretched in Ukraine. If it comes to a choice between Ukraine and Israel, where do you think they're going to go? So I think there is a real equipment problem that exists now, and there's no easy way of seeing it resolved. But there's also a manpower problem. Put brutally, the Ukrainians are running out of soldiers. Figures are incredibly difficult to get, not just in terms of casualties, but in terms of how many there were to begin with. The most reliable figures I've been able to find is that Russia, at the outset, Russia had an active military of 900,000 and a reserve of 2 million. The Ukrainians had an active military of 200,000 and a reserve of 250,000. Right? That's over 3 million compared with 500,000. Casualties have been very high. The Americans estimate that something like 500,000 people have died have died as a result of the conflict. It's been said that Russian casualties are been much higher than the Ukrainian ones. If we assume that 500,000 is 300,000 Russians and 200,000 Ukrainians, which doesn't sound sort of out of the ballpark figure, 200,000 out of, 500,000 is a lot of people. Furthermore, the Ukrainians are having difficulty in recruiting. All of the people who were gung-ho about the war are already in the forces. Many of military age escaped outside of Ukraine before they closed the borders. And it's quite clear that the reserve that Ukraine has is nowhere near as big as Russia's. Look at the population, 147 million compared with 44 million, 3 times. It's clear that Russia has the capacity to mobilise much more people than Ukraine does. So what this leads us to is where is it going to go? Sooner or later, you would assume that the Ukrainians are going to come to the conclusion that the only way in which they can retain Ukraine as a political unit is to negotiate. It may have to be a smaller unit, and even leading circles in NATO have been talking about the possibility of swapping peace for territory. Zelensky won't have anything to do with that. But I think the logic of the situation is that negotiation is going to have to come. The big question, I think, is actually not whether Putin is in danger of being overthrown, but in this context, whether Zelensky is. Thank you.
Many thanks, Graeme. We now have a good half hour for questions. Please wait for the intern armed with a microphone to reach you and then stand up and ask your question. We have at least 3 very eager hands. We'll start here.
Hi, Graeme. Thank you so much. Olga Boychak, the University of Sydney. I do agree with your assessment of the situation in Russia. However, with regard to your conclusion, do you realize that by advocating that the war cannot be ended anywhere near the Ukrainian terms, you advocate for ongoing genocide of Ukrainians like myself?
I'm not advocating for anything. All I'm saying is that the logic of the situation is that I think Ukraine does have no option, will have no option but to negotiate. Now, the terms of those negotiations are up to the parties to resolve, but at the moment, both sides have got positions which don't lend themselves to negotiation, because Ukraine says we won't negotiate, all the Russian forces are off the 1991 borders, and Russia is saying we won't negotiate until Ukraine recognises Russian sovereignty over the four provinces and Crimea. I'm not advocating it at all.
But is there a normative position that we can take? Is there a normative position that we can take in this, or do you feel like there's no normative position that we should be occupying in this?
The normative position is that well, there are two normative positions. One, Russia should not have invaded. Two, NATO should not have provoked Russia to invade.
We might need to move on, John.
I mean, sorry, can I just finish that?
Yeah, please.
I mean, the thing about NATO is that if you look at the sequence of events, it's quite clear that it was the prospect of NATO expanding into Ukraine which provoked the war. There was the association agreement between Ukraine and the US in November, which talked about the interoperability of Ukrainian forces, and what that meant was the integration of Ukrainian forces into NATO. There is the fact that in December, Putin offered to NATO a treaty effectively which would have neutralised Ukraine, and said to NATO, we will not invade if this is the case. There was the peace agreement that was worked out between the Ukrainians and the Russians in April of 2022, brokered by the Jewish Prime Minister, not by the Russians, by the Jewish Prime Minister, and the principal term of that was neutralisation of Ukraine. Zelensky accepted that. That was then reversed after Boris Johnson visited Kiev. In September of this year, Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, spoke to the European Parliament's Committee on Foreign Affairs, September the 7th. He said, quote, prior to the war, Putin, quote, sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us, and was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course we didn't sign that. He wanted us to sign that promise never to enlarge NATO. We rejected that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO, close to his borders. Even NATO accepts that. Not publicly, because that would then make them responsible for what's happened. But they accept it. And anybody who doesn't just does not look at the historical sequence.
I was going to ask something a little different, but it does seem to me, after doing a daily update on the Ukraine war for the last 18 months or so, that Putin has managed to positively guarantee Ukraine's accession legally or de facto to NATO. Now, what I was going to ask is not nonsense. What I was going to ask was, have you availed yourself of the SVR blog? And if not, I do recommend it.
Sorry, what was the name of the blog?
SVR blog.
No, I haven't looked at the SVR blog.
It tells you what Putin's had for breakfast and what his doctors are saying to him.
It seems unmissable.
You said at one stage it will be up to Ukraine to determine that it has to go to negotiations. My suggestion to you, isn't it Washington and the United States will determine if and when there will be negotiations? It seems to me that Ukraine is being fought to the last Ukrainian by the United States and NATO.
Well, I think that's right, and I think that if there was negotiations to take place, it would require American approval and presumably EU approval. But the Americans have consistently said that the negotiations must be between Russia and Ukraine. And unless they're between Russia and Ukraine, and there is some agreement that's going to be guaranteed by the rest of the community, it's not going to, no negotiated settlement is going to hold.
Our next question will, I hope, be a question.
This may be a very naive question, but I don't understand a lot about international affairs. But why is Ukraine joining NATO perceived to be such a great danger?
Why is it perceived? Okay.
Why is NATO such a threat to Russia, in other words?
Well, can I answer it? And I'll slightly rephrase your question. Why is NATO perceived as such a threat by Russia? Right. I mean, a lot of scholars argue that NATO is not a threat because NATO is not going to invade Russia. But a lot of people argue that the Russians perceive NATO as a threat for a number of reasons. One is because they believe that NATO and the US are involved in attempted regime change. And what they do is that they point to the colour revolutions that took place in a number of former Soviet countries, and they blame them on the US and to a lesser extent NATO. That's a very simplistic explanation that NATO and the US promoted these, but they did support them. They look at what NATO has done in terms of bringing about regime change in Libya, about bombing Serbia in 1999, traditional ally of Russia, about telling Russia that Russia would be the only country in Europe which can't become a member of NATO, apart from Belarus, which is probably even behind Russia in terms of the queue. So there is this perception that Russia is that NATO is inherently anti-Russian, and if you look at, there is no other reason to have NATO. In 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, there were two options, right? With the fall of the Soviet Union, one side of the Cold War disappeared, essentially. Warsaw Treaty Organisation disappeared. What could have happened was that an attempt could have been made to develop a European-wide security architecture, a new one. And that security architecture should include Russia. Or they could do what they did, and that was to go on a process essentially of expanding NATO. And so for Russia, the former Cold War enemy is still in a sense seen as being the enemy because they're not allowed to become a member of it, whereas everybody else is. The other thing I think which heightens this feeling is that up until well, at least 2014, a majority of people in Russia and a majority of people in Ukraine would have accepted that they had traditional feelings, if you like, that they weren't the one country, they weren't the same people, but they nevertheless were traditionally closely linked. Now, Putin has put it in an appalling way in saying that the Ukrainians are just Russians who speak a slightly different way. That's clearly wrong. But the majority of the populations in both, prior to the outbreak of the conflict, would have accepted that they have these common interests, that they have this common history, that a shared history. And what that feeling of sort of fraternal feeling, if you like, that many in Russia have for Ukraine, only heightens the sense of the danger that comes from NATO, from Ukraine joining NATO. You know, I mean, in a sense, Putin misjudged virtually everything in invading. It was, in fact, a stupid decision. If he wanted to prevent NATO from joining Ukraine, this was the best way to ensure that. Sorry, the other way around. Ukraine joining NATO. This was the best way to ensure that would actually happen, or would have increased the chances of it. He underestimated the degree of Ukrainian resistance that he would get. He overestimated the capacity of the Russian army. He underestimated the unity of the West in supporting Ukraine. So so at every level, Putin made an appalling decision. And it's appalling not just in terms of those sorts of considerations, but of course of the human cost.
We'll move on to some more questions. First this one, and then over here.
One comment and then a question. I think your description of the war as being an infantry frontline conflict is deficient in failing to recognise the role of technology, and particularly missiles and drones and all the rest of it. There's been a lot more effect of that and a much greater reach than you have characterised. But my question is, how do you justify Russia invading Crimea in 2014? And secondly, how do you justify Russia cutting off the grain exports from Ukraine, which are the essential feeding for the North Africans?
I'm not.
Can I just intervene to say it's not really appropriate to ask our speaker to justify assessments he's made. He's simply offering assessments of the reality as he sees it.
I accept that. I apologise.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say a couple of things. I mean, I accept what you say about the missiles, but Ukraine is totally dependent again on the West and the supply of those missiles, and up until now it's quite clear that Russian missiles have done a hell of a lot more damage than the Ukrainian ones have. In terms of Crimea, I mean, this is always going to be a difficult thing. Let me say at the outset, there is no justification for a country to invade another one. So what I'm trying to do is not to justify it, to explain it. The move into Crimea was essentially justified on the basis that this area was traditionally Russian, not Ukrainian. There is an argument that sort of supports that, but there are also arguments which go the other way. But the crucial reason for going into Crimea was because that's where the Russian Black Sea Fleet is based, in Sevastopol. And while an agreement had been worked out with Ukraine in 1994 or 5 to give Russia lease rights over that for about 30 or 40 years, the Russians realised or thought that if Ukraine became a member of NATO and Crimea was part of Ukraine, that military base, the Ukrainian part of it, would become a NATO base, which it would, and they weren't going. They wouldn't accept that. They wouldn't accept that. Just as the Americans wouldn't accept missiles in Cuba in 1960s, Russians wouldn't accept NATO. NATO base there.
Exports from Ukraine.
The grain exports?
Yeah,
Yeah. I don't justify it. But I'll explain why I think it was done. I think it was done in order to further disrupt the Ukrainian economy. Because this is, as far as they're concerned, sort of a total war on Ukraine. I don't think it's genocide, but it's a total war on Ukraine.
Thank you. A question for the gentleman in the very.
Graeme, thank you very much for your very interesting analysis. I'd like to make a couple of comments. First of all, about my ability to make those comments. I was born of a Russian father, and my mother was half Ukrainian, half Ossetian. Those who don't understand what Ossetian means, you can read Georgian. Now, after a while, I came to Australia when I was 7. My heritage is I'm a second generation Chinese, but I've explained what where my ancestry was. Now, when I was 30, I decided to go and to Europe, and while there, I got a job becoming the sales manager for the USSR. This was in Brezhnev's time. Now,
Can I just say we've got a lot of questions. Can you continue the discussion perhaps informally afterwards? Perhaps come to a question now.
right. The question or the comment actually is about the verification of Russian data. It is very hard to do, and I recommend that you might have a look at Konstantin Samailov, who is a blogger on YouTube, for comments about the Russian what the Russian thinking is.
Do you have anything to say?
Take it as a comment.
Take that as a comment. The gentleman, yes, please. And then,
Thanks very much for your talk. You mentioned the Jewish president of Ukraine, and then somehow related to, that's not related, but there could be a support going rather to the Middle East than to Ukraine. So is there any connection there? And what was the reason for that?
I'm not sure of the connection you're talking about. But Zelensky's Jewish, which is one of the reasons that it was a nonsense for Putin to claim that Nazis had taken over in Ukraine. It's nowhere near as simple as that. But I mean, I think Israel has played an interesting role in this thing. It's much more straddled the two than fallen in behind the Americans, as you would have expected.
we're getting towards the last couple of questions,
Okay.
so you and then the lady. That's right.
Tatiana Hartung. I'm from the Russian language publication Australiada. Professor Gill, thank you so much for your very detailed analysis and expose on what's been happening in Russia over the last 18 months. I think now we've turned towards more of the historical questions and perspectives, which I just would like to make a couple of comments. As far as Crimea is concerned, there was a referendum which was practically 19+% of Crimeans who voted to be with Russia. That's apart from, all the other historic perspective there. Also, from 2014, the eastern part of Ukraine was under bombing and shelling from the western part of Ukraine. And that has sort of been going unnoticed by the international public, unfortunately. This is just a couple of comments, but I have a question which might not be suitable for your discussion, but just tell me if you can make a comment or anything like that. What is the role of Australia in all these overseas conflicts? Australia is a multicultural, democratic country. And I think it's extremely difficult, especially now that we have another conflict in Israel and Palestine. It's becoming more and more obvious that there are problems.
Could we come to a question?
That is the question, if the professor wouldn't mind commenting on the role of Australia.
Yeah. Okay, just firstly on Crimea, yes, there was a referendum and it showed 99%, but it was undertaken under military occupation, and so the validity of it is questionable. However, a series of polls have been taken by Western opinion polling agencies, including the Pew Centre, which have also shown a majority in Crimea's support for remaining in Russia. Yeah. So there is a basic popular element of support for being in Russia. Whether it's 99% is sort of doubtful, but it is clearly there. On Australia's role, look, all I'll say is that I think that the Australian government has tied itself to the NATO bandwagon, and that's partly AUKUS, but it's also other things as well. It may be because of China, but I think that it's clear that the government has done that, and I reckon that's why they took the hard position that they took in regard to Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I think it'll also be reflected in the position that they take on Israel.
We've just got time for one last question.
Sure.
If you can find some more breath.
This one.
That's the very one.
Mine is that working? Yes. Mine is going to be much more a comment too, but seeking your response. And that is that John Mosheimer said some time ago that the focus in a multipolar world now should be on the Indo-Pacific. And he felt that the Ukraine could be sacrificed in that, and that in the future we need, in order to end the problems in Syria, etc., and to take on the challenge in this multipolar world with China, to align ourselves more and build up developments with the Russians rather than pushing them into alliance with the Chinese in order to ensure our future. What is your response to that?
Well, Mearsheimer is obviously a major realist theorist who does the realist calculations, and he says that this is the way that it works out. But one of the problems with realism as a doctrine in international relations is that it does not take account of culture. I mean, culture is an important thing in the way in which people interact and the way in which countries interact, and that can't simply be reduced to notions of national interest and counting forces and that sort of thing. The problem with the realist theorists is that they see the world essentially divided into two, because that's the only way in which realism works, or into antagonistic groups, and I'd much prefer to see us sort of try and work across those things. There's a basis for doing it with China, I would have thought, but again, I'm not sure the government's going to do that, because I think it's accepted to go down the sort of NATO/European route. I think that's a pity, but they've made their decision.
Thank you for your very generous answers to lots of curly questions and comments. Just on our coming activities, next week we'll be putting out a further edition of columns from Glover Cottages in which counsellors and interns recommend readings and other broadcasts and so on matters that you might find interesting in the international sphere. The following week, Tuesday the 24th of October, Dr. John Simons of Macquarie University will be talking about climate change and the problem of overshoot. We've already had 4 moments during this year, apparently, in which global heating was over the 1.5% target that we're supposed to be aspiring to. He's going to talk about the ways in which the international political system might be able to deal with those issues, including the lead up to COP28. But to round off this evening, I'd like to invite one of our interns, Daniel Yang, to deliver a vote of thanks.
Hi, thank you for speaking and educating more about the Ukraine situation. No matter your position, I think that we can all agree that this is something that is definitely a recurring issue, and it's unfortunately going to be here for a while longer. But I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I would like to motion a vote of thanks through applause.